and you have the coming to some sort of conclusion, but you have sort of the disadvantage, if you will, of sometimes that conclusion not being able to keep all of the different considerations that we care about in mind. So that's just something to keep in the back of our head. We're going to try to focus on medical halakha, touching on Jewish bioethics, but more the focus will be a halachic type focus, a legalistic type focus. Now, to take that idea one step further, legalistic ideas in the halachic discourse are communicated in lots of different ways. We have, first and foremost, codes, which are instances where rabbis throughout history have written specific ideas down, and they're being written for all time, for all places, and for all people. They're not being written in response to specific questions in a specific person's life at a specific time. That is called a responsa or a shut. Okay, she'elot utshuvot, questions and answers. Now, even in those two things, there's a real difference, because codes are focusing on principles, big picture, whereas responsa are focusing on narrow responses to a specific person in a specific place at a specific time. There's another group of ideas as well, which is commentary, where you have the Gemara, you have Jewish texts, and then rabbis are writing in those Jewish texts various comments about their thoughts. And in the context of writing their comments about, for example, the weekly parsha, you might encounter halachic information, or you might encounter legal, medical halachic information, whatever it might be, in the context of them writing about the Gemara, or in the context of them writing about the weekly parsha, for example. Now, that is a very different thing, because is that law? Is that not law? Well, it depends. Sometimes it's law, but sometimes it's not. When are things allegorical? When are things about inspiring people? When are things about practical at the ground law? So these are sort of some of the ideas that I want us to be considering and encountering as we're learning together. And what I've tried to do, if people look on the source sheets, are provide some of that context. I've tried to provide the sources in terms of the name of the book that we're going to reference, but I've also tried to provide the name of the person who wrote it, when they were writing, where they were writing, who they were writing to. And I think that's a really important part of this as well. So those are the little boxes in the far right column where I've referenced the different people. And hopefully by being aware of what discourse we're participating in. Are we participating in the medical halakhic discourse? Are we participating in the Jewish bioethics discourse? Within the medical halakha, are we talking in codes? Are we talking in commentary, or are we talking in responsa? Then we can try to bring things all together and keep ourselves organized. Because, and this is another disclaimer to make, everything that we're doing is theoretical. Everything that we're doing is educational. We are not trying to, in this session, these sessions at least, distill into specific guidance for particular people's lives. Just like, when you go to the doctor, that's a very different experience to when you see something on, when you read something in the newspaper. The thing in the newspaper is not, health advice that should be taken by any individual. So too, in what we're doing today, it's not health advice that should be taken by any individual person. And that's where the role of a rabbi who's knowledgeable in these areas, far more knowledgeable than someone like me, that's where the role of a posek, a halachic decisor, to help people work through these complicated and nitty situations in their lives. Because if the question is pretty surface level or straightforward, if something meat falls into a milk pot, you can often look that up in a book. And the implications of food not being kosher are probably not that deep. But in these sorts of areas, the implications of the content that we're learning is really personal, is really nuanced in people's lives. And that's something that I want everyone to sort of keep in mind as we're learning this, and that awareness that this really touches everyone's lives. So let's keep all of that in mind. One other final thing to note is when we talk about medicine today, that's often associated in people's minds with doctors. But we have to remember that Jewish sources are spanning thousands of years. Years when you didn't have a thing called a physio. You didn't have a thing called a nurse. So very often when we're encountering these sayings about doctors or about, specific healthcare practitioners, it's more useful to think of it as a general term to refer to all healthcare practitioners rather than as a narrow term referring just to doctors. Okay, I think that is a lot of our backgrounding done. Is that okay so far? Yes, onwards and upwards? Okay. I thought we'd get started with classical rabbinic attitudes towards medicine. When people say medicine today, often in the world that we live, I hope they're a relatively positive association. I hope, that medicine is something which can help people. Doctors and other healthcare practitioners are people who can heal, people who can guide people through different difficult things in life. And therefore, engaging with medicine would be viewed relatively positively. But we actually have a series of different views, a spectrum of different views in the rabbinic tradition around medicine. So let's start with our first source. And I've tried to sort of provide framing for us so we don't get too lost. But our first source is the one from Shimon. And this is a source which is discussing really how some of the rabbis ground the practice of medicine. Because let's keep in mind that particularly for a very traditional Jewish worldview, one might argue, well, a person has woken up and they are no longer well. Where did that come from? God. And if God has made them not well, well, what right do you or anyone else have to change that? Now, that as an argument might not be particularly resonant with a lot of us, but that's an argument that a lot of the rabbis are grappling with. What right do patients have to engage with healthcare systems? And what right do doctors have to provide healthcare? This is the will of God. So it's only because in the rabbinic mind, there are sources which say you can participate in healthcare that the rabbis feel comfortable to say, despite the fact that God has made you unwell, you should and can participate in healthcare. So that's where we're going to ground our first idea. So this is a source from Shemot, from the Torah itself. And Reu-ven anashim, when you have two parties, you have two people who are having a fight. V'hika ish et re'ehu, and a person hits another person. Be'even, with a stone, or be'egrof, or with a fist. V'lo yamut, the person doesn't die. V'nafal lemishkav, but they do find themselves bedridden. They fall. They can't get up. Im yakum v'yitalech b'chutz, if the victim gets up and walks outdoors, al mishanto, upon a staff, v'nikah hamakeh, rak shivto yiten, v'rapo yirapeh. If that happens, then no punishment, except what needs to happen? You need to pay for the person's loss of working abilities and also for their medical costs. So what's the case that the Torah is referencing? Two people have a fight, one person's injured, and the Torah is implying that the person who has injured, the person who is now injured, needs to pay the medical costs. Well, if you're paying medical costs, what does that imply? There are medical costs and you're allowed to engage in medicine. And that's exactly what the Gemara says. Mikan, from this source, we can infer shenitna rashut l'rofeh l'rapot, that a doctor has the permission, if you will, to participate in acts of healing. But again, it's because there's a textual source grounding it. And again, that's how the rabbinic relationship to medicine works and starts. There needs to be sources that ground ideas, even if we take those ideas as relatively for granted. So we have this source which says you can engage in healthcare. And Rashi says the point that we raised earlier, which is v'lo amrinan, and you don't say Rahmana machiv ihu masi, that Hashem has struck, and why does the physician have permission to heal? Rhetorically, do not say that. Instead, say God has struck, and that's right. physician has the right to heal. Okay. We'll keep going. We won't spend too much time on the Tosfot, but let's just keep in mind the Rashi, that first little box that we're encountering on the right-hand side. Because that's another thing I want us to try to encounter through this series. I don't want us just to have these ideas being moved forward. I want these ideas, I want us to know who said them, where they said them, to give us some context of who are the characters and what are the books that inform this conversation. So Rashi, as I'm sure many of you know, lived in the 11th century, and he was in France. And he wrote central commentaries on both the Torah and on the Gemara. And it's this commentary on the Gemara that we just referenced. Now, keep in mind, what did I say? This is a commentary on the Gemara. So it's not giving specific guidance. Keep that in mind. We'll keep going. So that provides us with one halachic perspective that engaging in healthcare is permitted. What's a step further that we've brought in the next lines? That engaging in healthcare is obligatory. So what's the difference between those two things? If something is permitted, if you don't want to engage in it, is that okay? Yeah. If something is obligatory, do you have a right to refuse?
No.
No. We'll come back to that point as well when we talk about autonomy soon. Okay? But you can sort of see how from the different halachic perspectives, there are practical implications that emerge, but we have to be careful about drawing those implications ourselves, and we need to see how the rabbis have treated these sources and these texts, rather than inferring, well, this argument would lead to that argument, and therefore you can't refuse healthcare ever, or something like that. Anyways, the next source comes from the Rambam. Now, the Rambam is obviously an incredibly big name, which I don't need to introduce to all of you here. An incredibly big name in this conversation as well. The Rambam was, at his time, which is the 12th century, the preeminent philosopher, the preeminent doctor, and the preeminent rabbi, all at the same time in the same person, which is amazing. And he wrote a commentary on the Mishnah. And in that commentary, he says, Shechayav harofeh min hadin l'rapot. The physician has an obligation to heal. So it's obligatory from what perspective? The physician. It's obligatory for a physician to heal. Who else might things be obligatory from the perspective of? The injured, the potential patient. That's right. And the Rambam says that it's obligatory from the perspective of the doctor to provide care, whereas the Rashba, who I did not bring, says it's obligatory for a patient, a person who's injured, to present to a doctor and say, hello, please help me. What might be the difference between those two opinions? So we'll keep going. So we'll get there. Yeah, that's where I want to go. Lovely. So let's keep going in the Rambam. The Rambam grounds his idea that it's obligatory to engage in healthcare in a pasuk, the same way as those earlier sources grounded in a pasuk. But the Rambam's pasuk says, so let's read it together. That the physician is obligated from the law to heal Cholei Yisrael, people who are Jewish who are unwell. V'harehu bichlal amram befeirush hakatuv v'hashevoto lo. It's grounded in the pasuk, and you shall return it to him. That's the pasuk talking about returning lost objects. And the idea would be that someone's health has been lost, and a doctor is able to find that person's lost health and return it to them in the same way that one might return a lost object to a person. And just like there's an obligation on a person who's walking down the street to pick up that lost object and try to find its owner, so too there's an obligation on the healer who's able to find and return that lost object, that lost health, to the person. Now, what if I've lost something and I don't want it back? Am I allowed to say to the person who wants to return it, no, thank you? Yeah, I don't have to take it back. So let's again stretch ourselves to think about autonomy, to think about someone saying to the doctor, I actually don't want you to treat me. I don't want my lost health back. I know you think you can return it, but I don't want that. That would work according to the Rambam. But the Rashba says it's obligatory on the patient. Well, if something's obligatory on the patient, can the patient say no, thank you? No. That's another thing that I think it's useful to keep in mind in halachic literature. Everyone's disagreeing with each other all the time about everything. And it's really hard to ground things. And what you almost have to do is step into the mind of the Rambam and work. And now we're going to step into the mind of the Rashba and think. And then we're going to step into the mind of the Ramban and think differently again. And that's really how you have to do it. You have to keep in mind that everything is in conversation, everything is disputed, and that's why you need very different types of that discourse in order to know what we're talking about and know what to do practically. Okay.
How much of this is dependent on the notion that life is of infinite value?
Excellent. We're going to come to that. We're going to come to that. So at this point, I think it's also worth one other point keeping in mind, which is why might someone say medicine is permitted but not obligatory? What might inform that perspective? What might motivate that perspective?
The patient is beyond help. There's extreme versions of injury and illness where either the doctor says, I can't do anything for you, or the patient says, I don't want to have anything done for me.
Sure. So that would be an instance where, for example, if we go back to our returning lost objects metaphor, you actually can't find and return a lost object, for example. Yeah, for example. Another way of considering why there might be a difference between the permitted and obligatory senses of medicine is put forward by Rav Kook. And I didn't bring this source because it's a little bit too long. But what Rav Kook essentially says is that let's keep in mind that medicine always requires and always consists of some level of risk. It's not 100%. And that risk can be known risks. For example, if you take this drug, it might be fine, or it might be an antibiotic and you might have diarrhea. So there are known risks. There are sort of expected side effects, things that often occur and are likely to occur to the person who takes it. There are also unknown risks around things like, well, I think what they told us at medical school is, 7 years, it's sort of the knowledge, 50% of it changes. Something like that, they told us. The amount of information that we're constantly learning and constantly thinking about and considering, and research is improving, means that sometimes and that's the history of medicine. Think about it, it's hard to think about it at the moment, but step back 50 years, think about common practices 50 years ago, and think about what we now know today to be quite different. So that's the point Rav Kook is seizing on, that medicine always involves known risks, known side effects, and unknown risks as knowledge continues to evolve. And as a result of that, Rav Kook says that's why Rashi and Tosfot don't feel obligated to say that medicine is something which you must. Medicine is always a should, or is always a option, but it's never a must, at least for Rav Kook's understanding of Rashi and Tosfot, because that's something you don't have to accept those risks on yourself.
So that's about the concept of consent, really, isn't it?
So that's another thing, is that one of the difficulties in the discourse is that there's often a split. So concepts don't always map neatly from one discourse onto another. So in sort of the normal way that we approach medicine, we're accustomed to framing what I just said and talking about consent and talking about informed consent. Whereas the rabbis have different words and different language, and hopefully if we get time, we'll get to that together at the end. But definitely in the way that medicine is practiced today, yes, informed consent is the way that we talk about that idea together. Okay.
You've made an important point when you talk about that these ideas could not have evolved in the 10th, 11th, and 12th century if physicians at the time did actually have the power to change the course. Because otherwise the discussion would be completely theoretical. Now, such actions on physicians at that time may have no impact in today's modern high-tech medical world and be considered rather primitive. But surely the assumption is that these people like the Rambam and others who were considered physicians were not just medicine men who did incantations and invoked God to get the patient better. In your knowledge of medical history, did they actually perform effective treatment?
Long conversation, but that's going to be, yeah.
Detail, but
yeah.
Just as a short answer, is my assumption correct that they could change the course of somebody's health?
I think that they certainly thought that they were changing the course of people's health. That's my understanding. But I need to mull it over a little bit more. Let's keep moving. And what we have in contrast to these, sort of motivated by the idea that I mentioned before around how, well, Hashem has given this and Hashem has made this person unwell, and what right does anyone have to do anything about something that Hashem sets up? And that's their view of the Ramban, and that's the view of the Ibn Ezra. And both of them, and there have been many other rabbis throughout history who have at different times taken this view, spoke about not engaging in health. Okay. What might be a response to that idea? How might you respond to the idea that, well, Hashem has made this the case, so you need to now deal with it? Perfect. This is one of God's creations. God has created medicine and God helps those who help themselves. And your obligation is to try and help yourself. On an individual level, that might mean going to a doctor. On a collective societal level, that might mean investing in medical research and trying to learn what is going to bring the helicopter that's going to save the guy on the roof from the flood, because you need to build a helicopter. So that's a response, and that's a response that certainly resonates with me. And especially, you know, I think that it's fair to say that a lot of people in this room would identify with the sort of modern Orthodox worldview and ideology, and that's an integral part of it. A modern Orthodox ideology is the need and the recognition that by working in things like medical research, that is doing something positive, not just to the world in general, but to our spiritual world as well. Okay. Notice that I said the Ramban. The Ramban is the name which I mentioned as the person who says medicine is not a good thing to engage in. Yeah? Okay. Pause for 1 sec. Any questions or anything else? No? People on Zoom, are we okay? All right. Feel free, by the way, people on Zoom, to send through a message in chat, and we'll get Rav Noam will be doing special comments with your special comments. Okay? Easy. So the Ramban. The Ramban was a doctor. And what's the Ramban advocating? Well, that's about a person who comes forward to the doctor. So we can go through the source quickly together, but I'm conscious of the time. Essentially what the Ramban says by doing it outside is, in an ideal world, people would not be engaging with doctors. It's a function of our sins. If you look in the Torah, if you look with who do people go to when they have a problem? The priests, the rabbis, the prophets. You know, in last week's parasha, there are plagues that are happening regularly throughout the Torah. What's the solution? It's not medicine. It's davening, it's engaging with Hashem, it's forgiveness, it's a sacrifice. People went to prophets. People don't go to doctors in the times of in what the Torah is putting forward as an ideal. But, you know, to our loss, we've descended and we have done bad things throughout our history, and we are no longer on those lofty spiritual heights that those people once were. So we need to, and it's so terrible, engage in medicine. But if we were only better people, then we would not need to. That's the Ramban's position in a nutshell. And then what the Ramban does is say that the doctor should always provide healthcare, because who is the doctor to decide that whether someone else is deserving of healthcare based on their spiritual level sort of stuff. But what I want to highlight is, remember the discourses. That Ramban is coming from where? Vayikra. What's Vayikra? Commentary. Vayikra is the Torah. The Ramban is writing a commentary on the Torah. In his commentary on the Torah, he's expressing a view that medicine is not such a great thing and people shouldn't really be engaging it in an ideal sense. But as soon as the Ramban, that self-same person, is starting to write halachic works, he totally changes his tune. And that's what we see as we jump over the page. Torah Adam is a book written by the Ramban, same person. And in this book, from a practical rather than from a theoretical perspective, he says, no, Pikuach Nefesh is a mitzvah rabbahi. Engaging in medicine is an incredibly important thing that people should always be doing. There is a mitzvah, there is a obligation, something positive, which is found when a person engages with medicine. And what I think the sort of simplest way to understand is that the Ramban is participating in different discourses. When he's creating a commentary on the Torah, what's he trying to do? He's trying to make a point. He's trying to say this is how the world should work, and this is an idealized sense. But when it comes practically to writing a book of halacha, like Torah Adam, which is the Ramban's famous book, written all about the laws around end-of-life care, as soon as it comes time to say something practical, he's saying, no, medicine is an incredibly important thing. And let's read inside what he says together. Aval, Hai Reshut, this permission which is granted to doctors to heal. Reshut, permission, de mitzvahu. It's more than just permission, it's actually a mitzvah, which an obligation is maybe a way to understand that word. It's hard to translate, but the mitzvah l'rapot, it is a mitzvah, it is a positive thing which occurs when a person engages in healing. Uvichlal, and specific in general, pikuach nefesh, this idea of life being valuable, saving people's lives, kiditnan, as it is taught in Ma'ach, as we taught, and this is a context around Yom Kippur. If you've got a person who is medically unwell on Yom Kippur, is that person meant to fast? Yes or no? No, that person is meant to. And not only are they meant to eat, they are meant to be made to eat. Ma'achilin oto al pi bakir. You have to feed that person on the advice of experts. I want to pause for a second. That's a fascinating statement that we just sort of jumped in and jumped out of. We make the person eat, we feed the person on the advice of experts. What we're seeing from the rabbis, just to spell it out, is a recognition of the role of medical expertise in informing halacha. Okay, I don't know if people are getting, that's a big deal. What we're seeing is that the rabbis are saying, I recognize your expertise in these areas, and what you say about the reality that I'm seeing in front of me is sufficiently important as to inform what the halacha should be. We don't generally do that in a lot of other areas of halacha. Generally speaking, except when it becomes particularly relevant, there's not, non-rabbis don't necessarily always have the authority or aren't given the authority to change halacha, whereas doctors are, healthcare practitioners are, which is really interesting to me. Okay, 3 dots. Upikuach nefesh mitzvah rabbi. And pikuach nefesh, saving lives, is an incredibly important mitzvah. It is a great mitzvah. Hazariz b'chachma zo meshubach. Someone who actively pursues it, really intensely pursues it, the knowledge of how to save people's lives, that's a wonderful thing. It's praiseworthy. Baha mishal, and a person who is asked questions in this area. So if you imagine the rabbi of a community, whose community feels obligated to ask that rabbi questions about this person who's dying or unwell at the moment and needs specific care. How are we allowed to break Shabbat to help this person? That rabbi is meguneh. How do we translate that? Meguneh is like despicable, repulsive. Why? Why is a rabbi who needs to be asked questions despicable and repulsive? Because it's a symptom of his community not taking pikuach nefesh seriously enough. The rabbi should have been advocating from the pulpit that, guys, anytime there is an instance of potential pikuach nefesh, anytime there is an instance of someone being unwell, that's not the time to ask questions, that's the time to help that person. If the rabbi is receiving questions, it's a function of that rabbi not communicating that message loudly and clearly enough to their community. Okay? And similarly, not only is the person who's asked questions not doing a great job, the person who asks questions is also not doing a great job. That person is shofech damim. Obviously, we're using hyperbolic language, but shofech damim means a murderer. That's a murderer, because you should have helped that person, not gone and asked about questions about whether you're allowed to call an ambulance on Shabbos. Obviously, you can call an ambulance on Shabbos. And how much more so someone who's mityaesh, someone who just gives up hope and does nothing. If, it's a hopeless situation, I'm not doing anything, and it's fine. That person's even worse. Any doctor who is knowledgeable in these areas has an obligation to heal. And if a doctor absents themselves, if a doctor steps back and says, I'm not going to practice medicine, I'm not going to help in situations where I can, that is murder. Again, hyperbole, but you get the point. Now, that was very strong language from the Ramban. As soon as the Ramban starts talking halachically in this source, what does he say? Please engage in medicine. Whereas when the Ramban is talking in theory, talking about how the world should be, when he's talking about from the Torah, giving his commentary, totally different tune. Keep that in mind. The next two sources that I've brought are the Tzitz Eliezer and the Yechaver Da'at. Both of those are contemporary or relatively contemporary sources, with the Tzitz Eliezer being Rav Eliezer Waldenberg. He died in 2006, but he was sort of the last 100 years. He was the Av Bet Din of the Bet Din in Jerusalem. And he was also the rabbi of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital. So in the setting of being the rabbi of Shaarei Tzedek Hospital, which is a religious and a hospital which abides by halacha and religious laws in general and tries to facilitate the keeping of halacha, he encountered a lot of medical questions and he became an expert. He was an expert in a whole lot of stuff, but he developed particular expertise in medical halacha, and his views on medical halacha, and he's a name that we'll keep coming back to over and over again, because it's difficult to take sources from the 1400s, from the 1200s, from the 1600s, or from 500 BC and work out what they mean in 2022. You need someone to bridge that for you. You need someone like Rav Eliezer Waldenberg or like Rav Ovadia Yosef or Rav Moshe Feinstein. You need these characters who can take that information and make it make sense in the world that we live in today. And that's the role of these contemporary poskim. So what's their view? The short version is engage in healthcare. I think rather than spend significant amounts of time on it, what I do want to make, what I do sort of want to note is, Tzitz Eliezer is a Ashkenazi posek. The Rav Ovadia is a Sephardi posek. It's unanimous across Jewish law that engaging in healthcare is a good idea. The questions emerge around whether or not, how much space is there for autonomy? How much space is there for autonomy? And at that, we'll pause for a sec. Are there any questions? Have I lost people? We on the same page? Any questions from here? Yep.
No, nothing confusing. I'm just wondering, so the Rashba compares giving medical treatment to returning something that's lost?
No, the Rambam. The Rashba does something different.
Okay, all right. Then the Rambam. So, and then given what we've just read, I was wondering, aside from doctors, what about the everyday schmuck? are we all then
Excellent.
obligated to learn CPR to be able to return that?
Excellent.
Or, what are our obligations?
Excellent. So that's another thing, is that I don't think there's an articulation of a necessity. There's an articulation on a societal level of a necessity for there to be doctors. That is something that halakha privileges and says things like, cities need to have doctors in them, just like they need to have a whole bunch of other things. That is a halakhic principle which is articulated. But it doesn't take that next step and say that Solly needs to do this, if that makes sense. And it still leaves Solly the choice to either become a doctor or become an epidemiologist or anything else that Solly wants to be, which I think is a nice space. And like the rabbis find ways to get to sort of the end conclusion of you get to make decisions in your own life in a lot of areas, but still strongly, they come at it from different perspectives than Western thought. And that's what we're going to see in the autonomy section. Is they're not saying that first and foremost, you have the choice, you get to make choices in your life because it's your life. Like it's not, this isn't a classical liberalism. It's a very different worldview and framework that it's engaging. But the end goal does end up being Solly gets to make choices in Solly's life.
So I think then
In some areas. Pardon?
So if somebody does go into medicine and they almost accept not just whatever comes with the territory, but also like a spiritual responsibility that you are therefore going to heal people. Like it's a responsibility. You don't have a choice once you opt in to learn this.
Yeah, which is maybe you don't learn, so you don't have this obligation.
Yeah.
Yeah, make life a lot easier. Yeah, make life a lot easier. Yeah. Any questions from people at home, Rav Noah? No, keep going. Keep going. Yep.
Relates to what Solly said.
Mhm.
The guys in Haftarah we admire for their alacrity in responding and their skill. Are they part of this halachic framework
Yeah.
as well?
Certainly.
And is there a difference there between them and trained physicians?
Yes, there's also a difference between an emergency room doctor who's doing one type of job and a GP who's doing a different type of job and a pathologist. Like there's an understanding of the specific roles. And that's part of why you need that nuance and specificity that an individual question to a rabbi who understands the depth can provide. Because like broad brushstroke principles aren't going to be able to filter into the specificities of our lives. Just like, you don't want to be getting your medical information from the internet. Same vibe. Yeah, Rabbi Noah?
I do have no, can't do that.
If you have questions, maybe we'll let you do that. Give people the ability to hear me at home. So someone's asked, can you comment on number one, the obligation to seek care versus the obligation to maintain your health?
Beautiful. Beautiful.
Take that first one, do the second one.
What's the second one?
Which one's better than answer one of them and just keep going. And number two, also very fascinating question. The need to have both a physical and spiritual solution to illness.
Okay. Both of those are heavy. Can I just say yes? Is that allowed? I think that, especially when we're seeing those three different worldviews, if we think about the tefillot, for example, like think about the Misha Beirachs or whatever that we say on Shabbat around people who are unwell. What we're trying to do is, on the one hand, recognize that the person is unwell and that is difficult. And we're also trying to say that, there's a role for prayer in this, and there's a recognition that God plays some role in this process. But at the same time, that exists against a backdrop of people being encouraged to go and seek medical attention. So what I sort of take from those three views is the need to maintain our respect of nature, respect of the role that God plays in our lives. And once we internalize that and also, help ourselves, like that's what I like about like the Jewish bioethics is you get to have your cake and eat it too. You get to take all of these ideas and try to integrate them in your life. You get to take there's a role for God and some things are beyond us. Medicine sometimes makes mistakes. You get to have all of these things in one conversation. And I think what our obligation is to find a way to hold all of those sometimes disparate and often contradictory parts that we are all true, even though they're contradictory. So, yeah.
That's what made a common sort that was discussing on people walking as you were talking about. I'm not sure if it was what you mentioned earlier, but he spoke about the idea of repentance, teshuva, and he said that a person also needs to do physical teshuva. And he said that physical teshuva is, returning to wholeness, but also recognizing that it is God who created the laws of nature, which is a fact like most religious people don't necessarily think about. That God created the laws of nature that mean that if you do these particular things, it's good for you, and if you do these things, it's not good for you. So he saw unhealthy lifestyles and practices as actually a violation of the will of God.
So I think that very much answers that question about the need to look after ourselves and prevent ourselves from becoming unwell. One other quick detour on that point is to say that especially in contemporary times, a lot of the Jewish sources do tend to be reactive. It's very easy to find halachic sources that talk about someone who collapses and the need to call an ambulance for that person now. Whereas things like Solly's an epidemiologist. He said to me that it's okay that I say that out loud. But things like, public health measures or these broader things that, we're implementing to prevent things going bad, there's less halakhic literature on that. And that's more part of the work that I think, to be honest, since there's been a state of Israel, that there's been more halakhic attention turned to, well, what happens if you turn off all of the air conditioners in the state and you don't make power on Shabbat? Well, then people are going to die. So, there is some of that forethought which is entered into the halakhic discourse. And I think that, Israel has been an accelerator of that stuff entering into the conversation. All of that being said, that it's definitely not the majority of the conversation still at this point. A lot of it does tend to be reactive, but there are other sources that talk about the need, for example, the don't smoke, the problems with smoking, and sort of halakhic problems with smoking. Yeah.
What about things like wearing masks?
Yeah, so that's not a conversation for right now, but that is certainly a conversation. And there's a lot that's been written in the coronavirus pandemic about halakhic responses and attitudes. And there's heaps and heaps out there. People are pumping out books already. We'll keep going because I'm also conscious of the time and don't want to keep people too late. I've briefly quoted what has sort of become standard as the ways to talk about biomedical ethics, at least in the Western world. And these are sort of the 4 principles. So this is the section number 3. This is the section about autonomy. And these are what's known as the 4 principles of medical ethics. I'm sure, Eitan's smiling because it probably turned up in a multiple choice exam of his at some point. Did it? Yeah?
Many times.
There you go, many times. So these are very, very common. And what are these 4 principles? Number 1 is autonomy. And I'm putting it as number 1 because it is privileged over the other 3. Autonomy in the sense of the right to make your own decisions. You have your own body and your own life, and you get to decide. And a doctor can't whack you over the head and start sticking antibiotics into you just because the doctor thinks it's a good idea. You need to consent to any medical treatment. Autonomy, number 1. And if you say no, even if the doctor thinks it's a really bad idea, people leave hospital all the time before the doctors think that they're ready to. They're discharging against medical advice. They're allowed to, assuming that they're competent to. Autonomy, first and foremost. And the other ones are do good things, is called beneficence. Don't do bad things, don't harm, help and don't harm. So it's like the flip side of each other. Beneficence and non-maleficence in fancy, ethics language. And the last one is justice, which is often understood as a distributive justice. We've got obligations to the entire society and we can't invest all of our resources in one person. We have to be conscious of all of the people who are before us and sort of making sure that things are fair. And that can also be, processes should be fair, et cetera, et cetera. That's standard in medical ethics. And, that was on my medical exams. I'm sure for people who've sat exams in those sorts of disciplines, very, very standard to talk about it. So autonomy. And autonomy is privileged over the other 3. What do our sources say about autonomy? Let's just pause for a sec. What do you think they might say about autonomy based on what we've learned?
I'm not so sure that we do actually. And in the sources, we do actually have the right to choose.
Why not? Because
God gave us the whatever it is.
God has autonomy, certainly. Yeah, so I think there's this idea in the sources that we've encountered that you have an obligation to look after yourself. You have an obligation to look after your own life. And that's wonderful when it's being used to say something like, you should therefore go and see a doctor. But when that might make people a little bit more uncomfortable to see that it's often used to say things like, you should say yes to what the doctor says. That might make people a little bit more uncomfortable. And that's how it's often used. You don't have a right to hurt yourself. It's one of the ideas, like within Jewish law, that we don't view it as your body. Your body is, if you will, on loan from God, and your obligation, including through things like not smoking, is that we look after our bodies. Is that, if we have some sort of illness and we need some sort of treatment that medical science can provide, you don't necessarily have the authority to say no. Now, again, we have to remember what conversations we're having. The conversations about whether to say no to treatment at the end of life is a separate conversation, and that shouldn't be read into from this conversation. Treat that separately and look at the literature on that topic separately, which hopefully we'll be doing together next week. But at least in principle, if someone breaks their arm, they don't have the authority to say, I'm not going to hospital to get my broken arm fixed. If someone has a heart attack and they need something, they don't have the authority to say, well, I don't want you to do an angiogram. If the doctor says you need a stent, they don't have the authority to say no, potentially. So that's kind of the argument that's being put forward. And we can see that Rav Yaakov Emden, who's from the 17th century, he puts that, and the 18th century, he puts that argument forward. And he says, in the case of an illness or wound which is exposed, about which the physician has definite knowledge and clear recognition, and which has a proven and complete course of treatment. So notice that we're not saying experimental treatments, or we're saying, well, I can help you, but only a bit. We're saying the doctor can totally help. Medicine can totally help. The doctor knows what they're doing. They've encountered this before. You need antibiotics. Otherwise, you're going to have a big problem because you're septic. Broader conversation, but yeah, it's too complicated to get into because there is specific literature and there are considerations either way. But certainly from the place of refusing refusing to help themselves and refusing to help society, that is not viewed positively within a Torah literature. Yeah, that's not viewed positively. Just give me a tick. So it is certain that we always impose, notice the word, impose the treatment on a patient who refuses. We impose the treatment on a patient who refuses if his life is in danger. So it needs to be a case of someone who's septic who needs antibiotics. It's not a case of someone with a broken arm. The broken arm is different because if or broken finger, you don't have to get your broken finger fixed. Even though your finger is not straight and I can make it straight, that's not up to you, whatever. You can make that decision yourself because pikuach nefesh only kicks into gear around life. So that's another thing to keep in mind is that the conversation about life ending as opposed to medical care, which will improve certain things, or at least you do have authority to make decisions about what you want to improve in your life. You don't necessarily have authority to make decisions about whether you want to end or continue. But again, the end of life conversation is a separate conversation. When I say end of life, I mean when people have some sort of terminal illness. That's a separate type of conversation. But the 30-year-old young person who needs antibiotics because they're septic, that is the sort of example I think that this would, in a way, be speaking to. Just give me a tick. In all such cases, we certainly perform the procedure and even force him because of the value of saving a life. This is incumbent on every individual because of the command to not stand idly by the shedding of your fellow's blood. So that's not a very autonomous position. There are spaces for autonomy around the sort of low level conversations, but fundamentally there's a different relationship with autonomy that's being put forward by the rabbinic sources. Yeah.
I feel there's a strong cultural element to this, especially looking at Rabbi Emden, who lived in Germany in the 18th century. They had a very authoritarian direction of physicians. make decisions based on their expertise, which would be almost universally accepted. And anyone who didn't accept such things was regarded as a fool or a rebel.
Yeah. And that's part of why I think the context of the specific people is really useful.
I'm sure the doctors did not explain the risks to the patient before they ordered whatever medicines they had. And they certainly didn't have antibiotics
Sure.
in those days. So they would have been doing other things like chopping limbs off, where you got gangrene.
Yeah.
That's an extra medical practice.
Yeah.
Patient really didn't have a choice because the health professor says that leg has to go because there's a gangrenous stuff out there. It just has to go.
Yeah.
Without any mention of the risk to life.
Yeah.
Give
Certainly.
them the rum, give them the brandy, whatever they have, and that was it. Yeah. I think today's world is actually different. There is a different relationship between doctors and patients. And I know the surgeons have to recite chapter and verse on what the risks are to the patient before they give the patient the sheet to sign.
Certainly. Certainly. Yeah. Because I'm conscious of the time and want to make sure people get out in the next little bit. The source that we just quoted, Rav Yaakov Emden, is from the 18th century. A little bit's changed in the 18th century. Particularly, you can't really tell people what to do so much. That doesn't fly in the same way that it might, to speak to the same points that you were raising, that our society has changed, the legal frameworks in which we're operating have changed. And Rav Moshe Feinstein is writing in New York. He's writing in New York, and he is the greatest posek of the halachic decisive of the 20th century. And he's writing in New York. What I find fascinating about what he writes is, on the one hand, he's committed to the same ideological position as Rav Yaakov Emden. He's committed to this idea that you don't necessarily have a right to make bad decisions about your body. But he also needs to be sensitive in how he presents that, because he's living in America in the 20th century. And that's what I find fascinating about this source that we'll read together quickly. Regarding a patient that refuses to take a treatment, if the patient's refusal is because he does not trust his physicians, then we must find him a physician that he trusts. Yes, that's my mistake. I'm sorry. Find him a physician that he trusts. So that's a really interesting entrance into why might someone be refusing. And the first question that Rav Moshe is getting us to ask is, what's going on in this person's mind? They're not, if they agree, if what you're offering is a really good idea, well, people are more or less rational. They more or less agree that people want good things to happen to them sometimes.
Sometimes they're rational.
Yeah. So, he's asking us to ask, why might someone be refusing this? If there is no doctor who the person trusts, and because of the illness, there's no time to wait until that person realizes that treatment is necessary for their well-being, then, and I'm going to skip, the physicians must coerce the treatment. So long as all the physicians of the hospital agree, so there needs to be some sort of medical consensus that forcing it is a good thing. And in that instance, Rav Moshe says it's theoretically permissible to force. But he flips. He does a backflip. And how does he backflip? It can't be in a way that will scare the patient. If the patient's scared, even if his fright is foolish, the treatment should not be administered, since the fright could harm him. Rav Moshe is getting us to evaluate, not only is the treatment in the abstract beneficial to the patient, but practically, is the treatment so beneficial to the patient that the benefit of that treatment outweighs the negative consequences of coercing the person? How good is this thing? Is it so good that it is good enough to outweigh the negative side of coercing the person? And the answer to that question is almost always going to be no. That's what Rav Moshe is speaking to, because as a doctor, you have a right to help. You don't have a right to hurt someone in the process of helping. So I love how he ends up at a point where practically he doesn't notice that he's not grounding the autonomous answer in autonomy. He's not grounding it by saying, well, people have a right to choose and people can make bad decisions, so let's just be done with it. He's getting there, but in a different way. And that's often characteristic of halachic sources, the way that they get there, the logic that they employ, and the fidelity to different values is quite different from what we're used to encountering in our Western society and culture. That's something to keep in mind. There was potential for another section, but I think we can leave that. Just to notice, yeah, I think we'll leave that for another time if we get a chance. But I think that one thing that's worth noting is a few years ago, Rabbi Professor Avraham Steinberg, he actually spoke in that next room over there. He came to Blake Street when he was in Australia. He is the current, I think, the medical director of Shaare Zedek Hospital. And he's also like an authority on, he wrote the Encyclopedia Talmudis, which do we have a copy next door? I don't know. If we don't, we should get a copy. But he's a huge deal in the medical halachic world, in the medical world, and in the halachic world, all at the same time. So he's a very special person. And we had the privilege of hearing him in our shul a few years ago now. One of the things, not in this talk, but in a different talk that I heard him speak about, was the law in Israel currently. And again, this could be out of date, and I'm not professing to be a legal expert at all. However, the way that he presented at that time was that the law in Israel was, we sort of need to get consent from people, but we don't let people make really terrible decisions. And therefore, what he called it is the way the Israeli law is founded is on some sort of retroactive consent. So post facto, after you've saved the person's life, the assumption is that they were happy with you for doing that. And therefore, you've gotten the consent post facto, i.e., before they give that consent, in instances where it's necessary, you still force people.
At first and apologize later.
In very specific, narrow cases. But, you know, that sort of law, with the exception of you need to argue that a person is not able cognitively to make that choice in the Australian legal system and in lots of other Western systems, that's the only time you can force someone. That's the only time you can override someone's autonomy if you can argue that they don't have the capacity to make that decision. However, in Israel, from what Rav Avraham Steinberg was describing, that wasn't necessarily the case. And that was just a fascinating example for me on how to bring quite a few of these different things together. We'll take a few quick questions. You want to go?
Yeah, just in regards to the last question that Rob defined. When it says it's as if the physician may have murdered an individual correctly if they are completely nervous, like say high anxiety, potential for a panic attack, at what stage does physical health override mental health?
That's a fascinating question. And I promise that's not a planned question, because like the reason why it's such a great question is Rav Yoni Rosenzweig is going to be coming to shul this week. And Rav Yoni is the perfect person to speak to that specific question. He's a rabbi who's going to be giving a drasha at Blake Street this Shabbat, and he's styled himself around being a world expert in the intersection of mental health and halacha. So he's much better positioned than me to answer that type of question. I think, you know, the question is better than any specific answer that I'll give. That's the honest truth. You know, you've identified core important concerns. What that actually manifests as practically is very context specific.
Our question doesn't actually relate to, but if the doctor has a patient who is, for example, a Jehovah's Witness who won't take a blood transfusion, is the doctor obliged then to impose his...
Are we talking about a kid or an adult?
But I'm talking about, you know,
yeah, so... And that's another part of this conversation as well, is that we have to remember that halachic conversations around this sort of stuff are also interacting with often secular Western legal systems and with people who might not necessarily subscribe to halakha. Like often rabbis are thinking in idealized worlds, except when they're writing in shut, except when they're writing in responsa. So you have to and that's, you know, when you mentioned vaccines, like we have to be careful about taking an idea that we think might apply, but we have to think about all the other considerations that apply in that situation as well. So, you know, the question that we need to ask about whether to force someone to have a blood transfusion who's refusing is, what about, you know, you're not going to be able to practice as a doctor, you're going to end up in court. Well, how halachically bad is that outcome? And the answer might be a lot, or it might be not a lot. But the reality is we have to ask that question before we can give a definite answer to what we should do. Does that help? Yeah, it's all complicated is the short version. Yes.
You might deal with this next week. If someone asked, Robert asked, what about if somebody said, do not resuscitate?
Yeah.
How do we deal with that? It might be in place.
Yeah, I think that's better to talk about for next week. Just to say that what we've sort of been speaking about today is not end of life considerations. It's very much focused on people who, quote, might be making bad decisions. And I think that everyone would agree that when someone's at the end of their life and making a decision not to be resuscitated, or the medical team's making that decision, it's a very different world and it's a very different conversation. So I think that it's too broad to discuss, and hopefully next week we'll do some thinking in that area.
When Ross asked about Jehovah's Witnesses, this raised the question of whether halacha applies to non-Jewish.
Very interesting question.
Is there a distinction then between which a Jewish doctor would deal with patients?
Fabulous questions, and I think that's going to be too much to get into at the moment. But just even here, like these ideas, there's so much, and there's just popcorning of ideas that we need to work through. And that's hopefully that's the point, is that this can be an introduction for us, but noting that there's so much more to discuss.
So just for Yaakov Emden on autonomy and his overruling of autonomy, does that also include preventive care? So, for example, a 20-year-old who's smoking, they're not going to die necessarily anytime soon, maybe when they're 15, but can you force them to give up smoking at a 20-year-old?
Yeah. So again, context specific. Yeah, I think sort of what I mentioned earlier about modern conversations and questions. I don't know if people. I think that was sort of touching on that question specifically, sort of thinking about the contemporary state. I think that's interesting. Yeah.
And again, no great detail, probably for next week or a week after. Suicide. A person decided to end his life because he was undergoing, for him, unbearable trauma. Is that sort of also the same, treated the same way as wanting to not continue treatment at the end of life?
Yeah.
It's not at the end of his life. He feels he wants to.
Yeah. To be honest, like I think that a treatment of a topic that's as difficult and personally confronting, and I think a topic like that needs, like, I'm not going to be able to do it justice on one foot. So I think it's better that I don't engage deeply with it. But to say that, again, that's a fabulous set of questions that unfortunately are all too real for a lot of people. But at the same time, that halacha certainly has conversations, and Rav Yoni might be in a better position to talk about it. But yeah, there's a lot there, and there's so many questions. And I think, even from this, we can see all of the questions that are emerging. Any others? Yeah.
I think there's just a dichotomy about what doctors think about things and what patients think about things. That's very hard for everybody to understand the whole problem.
Yeah.
And to come to consensus and to find the right guy and the right person is an incredibly difficult problem. And sometimes the patient is wrong, and sometimes the doctor is wrong.
Yeah. And then once you add a third character of the rabbi in, you got all three interesting people sometimes in conversations. Yeah, certainly. I think unless there are any, I'm happy to stick around and discuss further. Just to note, thank you all very much for coming. Really, really appreciate it. We'll be doing sessions every week for the next 3 weeks. And specifically, thank you to the Distiller family for sponsoring. And all of our learning should be so that the Neshama has an aliyah. But thank you all very much.